Welcome to the show, Jay. Pleasure to have you here today, man.
Nice to be on, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, for the audience's benefit as well as mine, could you tell me and start with what is it exactly you kind of like specialize in your background?
Yeah. So I mean, I do a few things. So I work for a public affairs firm. Yeah, international. We do international work. We do national work. We do lots of
Hmm.
things. But I cut my teeth on politics. I started when I was 19 years old. I was working for then Congressman John Kasich at the time, and I did that. Helped him build a gubernatorial campaign after I was in the private sector with him, and we happened to win governor and set up his presidential campaign as well. So I do some politics as well too. I've done races since then, but that's kind of how to cut my teeth. And what I do now is I advise companies, I advise nonprofits on a variety of different things, strategic decisions. But I still dabble in politics every now and then with a few high-profile races.
And from you mentioned helping Kasich set up his campaign, governor and presidential, and when he was in Senate. But also, I saw in the bio, as mentioned, JD Vance as
Yeah.
of recent. So obviously, in those endeavors, a lot of it comes with strategy, and a lot of it comes with,
Sure.
what niche maybe of the party you're going to, multiple niches, say, or just a few, but who's your target audience? Because something we're getting to a little later is the Republican Party. There's divisions, as in the Democratic Party, of
Sure.
voters. And I guess to dive right into it, how do you see those divisions becoming ever more present in campaign strategies when you're not just talking to one specific voter, say the Republican voter, you're talking and trying to appeal to three different types of voters?
Yeah, look, I think that's always been the case.
Hmm.
In Europe, you have coalition governments where you have multiple parties in a lot of countries where they each represent, a very small sliver of the population. We happen to have a two-party system where those
Hmm.
slivers of the population fit under two larger umbrellas, primarily. So I think historically in this country, that's always been the case. It just shifts in terms of who those folks are, where those alignments are, but it still comes out as one of the two major political parties. So I don't think from the standpoint of that being the goal, talking to multiple different audiences at once is different. It's just who you're trying to motivate, how you're trying to motivate them. That's what the strategy a lot of times goes into, and when you're going to pull the trigger on those kinds of things.
Got you. And regarding the 2024 Republican primaries, how can you currently lay out the field and maybe some of the more major candidates, because there's quite a few now?
There's always
How
going to be, yeah,
Yeah, a lot. And but with that, how do you see some of the more major candidates approaching this issue?
Look, I think the way when you look at the Republican Party right now, and
Hmm.
we should really talk a little bit about 2016 and how that happened and how that informed it. But if we just talk about it right now, it is really Trump versus the field,
Hmm.
and that's the way this is played out. So, and if you pay attention to politics at all, there's a narrative, and I don't always subscribe to these big narratives that are in the media. I think that most times they're very flawed, but there is one that I think is extremely correct. The more candidates in the race, the more it helps Donald Trump. And so when you have Ron DeSantis there polling at where I don't know what the latest polls at where he is right now, but
Hmm.
wherever he is, he goes up, he goes down, but he is definitely impacted by all the other candidates in there. Someone would, in order to beat Donald Trump in the Republican primary right now, you really do need a one-on-one race, in my opinion, or basically a one-on-one race.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's always going to be some other people running, but I mean, one-on-one in terms of like major candidates. And the more that get in, the more successful they are, the more they take away from that slice that is against him or willing to look the other way, look at another opportunity for
Hmm.
another opportunity. And I do think that that benefits him. So the way I look at it, I mean, you've got Donald Trump. He's definitely in pole position and the likely nominee, in my opinion. And you've got Ron DeSantis, who is he's liked by much of the electorate, the Republican electorate, but they don't like him more than Donald Trump. And
Hmm.
then you've got a handful of other candidates that have either run before or are looking to make a name for themselves, but they've all got good, good credentials to doing this. And You've got Tim Scott, you've got Chris Christie, who's a very talented communicator, in my opinion.
Hmm.
You've got Nikki Haley, and you've got a handful of other folks too, and they're all going to take from that one slice, and maybe take a little bit from Trump. Mostly, they're going to take from the other side that wants someone else.
For sure. And a lot of the news I get from is from Breaking Points that features Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball, and they really analyze a lot of what you say and would agree with it as well. With that, do you think a lot of these candidates, such as Nikki Haley, such as Tim Scott, a few others, the ones who are in the race, but they're not really speaking negatively towards
Mhm.
Trump? You have Nikki Haley, when asked like how is she different from Trump, she will deflect and say, "We're not kicking sideways or kicking forward." I don't know if you heard that clip, but it's kind of funny. But with that, do you think they really believe they can win this race, or do you more
Sure.
so you really are confident
Yeah, I think
they believe they can
look,
win the
I think
race?
most people will say you go into a race thinking that you can win, and if it doesn't work out, maybe you'll take a cabinet position. There's another side,
Yeah.
but you
Hmm.
normally don't run unless you actually believe you're going to win. I mean, I actually do believe that. And what I would also say is too is the media always wants to accelerate the race.
Hmm.
When you're a strategist or you're a candidate, you're looking at it on your own terms. You're not looking at it through the eyes of what a pundit on NBC or MSNBC or
Hmm.
Fox News, whatever, says you should be doing, because they don't know. They're just guessing. You're looking at your own numbers, you're looking at your own research, and you're trying to figure out, okay, when do I pull the trigger on this thing? And you're trying to influence that message, certainly. You're trying to back channel that to certain reporters or certain pundits, but you're doing things on your own terms. And I think a lot of what we hear out there, it gets kind of like a mushy kind of narrative that everyone kind of agrees to inside DC, and it's almost always wrong, is what I would
Hmm.
say. Now, that doesn't. I don't think that Nikki Haley's going to win. I don't believe that she's going to win this thing. I don't understand the case for it. But she has every right to run, and she has every right to try to impact this as much as she can. But there, look, I do believe that Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. I think that's what I think is going to happen. And
Hmm.
I'm not a Trump guy myself. I've never been necessarily a Trump supporter, but that's the way I see how this plays out. But things can change, and you also have to let the campaign play out before you say this. Things change a lot. As you mentioned, I did JD Vance's campaign this last
Hmm.
time. I was a strategist for that race. When he first announced, you could count on one hand the number of people in Ohio, the number of insiders that thought that he was going to be the next senator. Now, I saw the path clearly. I thought this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to get from point A to point B. But the campaign has to play out and has to be allowed to play out. And pundits don't like that because they want to be able to say that they know what's happening.
Hmm. That's an interesting take, and definitely seems rather well thought through. But you spoke
Well,
of
it's years of
mhm.
frustration of doing
Yeah,
this and
yeah,
then
I could
having
tell
to
there's
deal in this media ecosystem.
mhm,
It's a really frustrating thing from my standpoint, because I
mhm,
think there's so few good reporters out there. I think there's so few people that actually know what they're talking about. They're few, but
mhm,
they're few and far between.
mhm. So there's a couple of questions that come immediately with
Yeah.
that, but one of the things that you mentioned is you never know what's going to happen, and that's true. You never know what's going to happen in the Republican primary, the Democratic primary, in life in general. With that, with Trump being indicted now in New York and Florida, how concerned would you be if you're on his campaign, you're a strategist in his campaign, how concerned would you be with that derailing the campaign and say putting him out for launching a more presidential being the nominee for the Republican primary?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's definitely concern here because you don't know exactly how this is going to work out. Now, I think politically, there's a lot of benefit to what
Hmm.
these indictments, and we can talk a little bit about that. But of course, there's concern because there's real legal jeopardy, especially with this federal case and with something that could be coming up later too. So there's legal jeopardy, so that obviously has an impact. But here's what I would argue on the indictments too. Um, there is and people, and I think the media gives this lip service, but there is a true feeling amongst voters out there, amongst Americans, not just Republicans, mind you, but Americans that are living in middle America, that the institutions just don't work for them anymore, that these
Hmm.
things are just flawed. So I will say that a lot of people look at this latest Trump indictment, and we're talking about the federal one right now.
Yeah.
When your listeners listen to it with the documents in his bathroom, um, people look at that and they say, okay, yeah, that was wrong. He probably should have done that. But how is this materially different than what we just saw Joe Biden with his materials in his garage,
Mhm.
or when Hillary Clinton had documents on a server that she actually destroyed, and investigators weren't even able to look at it? How is this different? Maybe it's just the elites doing what the elites do always. And so it breeds more dissatisfaction with these institutions we're supposed to look up to and believe are fighting for us. Now, the folks in the media, who, by the way, people don't trust at all anymore, they want you to believe their viewpoint on this thing. But I'm just telling you, the way I think this plays out for most people is it's like they all do it. It's all the same. And why are you going after one guy? So, how does this play out? I think that, look, I know for a fact that they're concerned. They're concerns about it. And they're
Mhm.
messaging on it. And they're working on it as a team, because I know some of the folks that work with in that group. But I also don't know that's going to have the political impact that most of Washington D.C. thinks it's going to have.
And could you not say that kind of surmises Trump's 2016 campaign when the people who disliked him and there's this feeling among middle America, among your daily Americans that voting for him, they may not be overly enthused of who he is as a person, especially his moral character, but how he represents a rejection of elites in DC, of the status quo.
100%. That's an accurate assessment of it too. And look, I was on a campaign that was against him. I
Mhm.
saw it firsthand. I was in the debate in
Yeah.
the at the debates when he was there. And look, I will also say this too. So the media loves to rail against him for the most part. I'm not talking about conservative media.
Mhm.
Let's take them out. I'm talking about the other folks. And I think only someone that is completely bought into the left would argue that there's not a constant negative pushback against Donald Trump. That's all they talk about. But I will also say that they made Donald Trump. Jeff Zucker chose to put him on CNN all the time.
Mhm.
He used to phone in to Morning Joe on MSNBC in the morning, and now they're his number one detractors. But back then, they would take his calls, and they wouldn't take any other candidate's calls, but they took his calls. They loved the ratings boost, and they were. I remember one producer I talked to them about said, "It's like crack. We know it's bad for us, but we need to do it anyway. We can't help
Mhm.
ourselves." Because there was always the ratings chase. So look, they built this, they allowed this to happen, and now it's also good for ratings for them to be on the other side too. So I'm very cynical towards how these guys operate, and I think Americans are too. I mean, I think they know it. I remember doing one poll, and I know we're a little bit off track on this, but
No
I remember
worries.
doing a poll during this last Senate race I was involved in, and it was these were Republican voters, but it was really, do you trust do you trust any of these news sources to be unbiased? And even with Fox News or these other ones, they didn't think that they were unbiased. They understood the bias. They get where the bias comes from. They get but they think they're all biased. And they actually, the interesting thing is, one, I can't remember the survey I did, but it was actually the BBC where they thought was the most unbiased. The BBC
Hmm.
and the Wall Street Journal were the two most unbiased. And this is Republican primary voters in Ohio at a couple years ago. So they look at that and they say, these are the ones that are actually telling us what we want to know, the news. We cannot underestimate how bad the news media has become and how much the American people distrust them. And I think that is sowing a lot of the angst in this country.
There's a number of things you said, all of
Lots of
which
things, I know.
very interesting, and I want to touch on a ton of them. But what was the one that immediately came to mind that was just on tip of my tongue, which regarded to media? Oh, it were kind of going to the realignment of the parties because now you have people who. Oh, this is what it was actually. So in 2008, 2008, you had John McCain.
Yeah.
2012, you had Mitt Romney, both losing campaigns, presidential campaigns. Analysis that is not mine, but I thought made a lot of sense to me when hearing it, and based on some survey data as well, is both those people they may not be moderate in all their stances, but they're very well, lukewarm, I think was one of the words used. Very like white bread, very what you're gonna get with them. What the
Yeah.
Republican Party really wanted was a fighter. And that's what they saw in Trump, and that's what they see in some of these other people, the rise of the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party. They want someone who was willing to fight for them and their values and not just say okay and not just go along with it and be all what's the word, formal, I guess, and being so polite. They want someone who is going to insult, going to fight, going to go on the attack, and not just take it from the other side. And that's what I think a lot of people see in Trump and what he represents. And they may not like all that, but they absolutely detest what the other side say. When I say the other side, I kind of just mean like elites,
Hmm.
even though Trump himself is obviously elite, but he's fighting elites
Hmm.
as well. And people are really just drawn to that. So regarding the realignment of the parties, because Trump's not establishment, the establishment weren't preferring him. It could have been something like Rubio, Bush, a number of other people in 2016. But that was their guy, and that's who they had support. But over the years, there's a lot of quarreling, a lot of fighting, infighting. But and now you see it kind of more than ever a little bit. But the point being is that the base is very kind of straying off from the establishment more and more. And it kind of begs the question, which is the base even like is the establishment, excuse me, really representing the base in any capacity, or is it really like Trump now kind of capturing the base and dictating the values? Because Trump's rather moderate on certain programs such as social security, such as the war in Ukraine, such as these more hawkish people within the establishment on both parties. And
Yeah,
he's
look, and
mhm,
I think these are really interesting conversations to have, and I think there's a realignment going on in both parties that's happening, and we are at the probably in the third inning of that realignment. Look, political parties throughout history, if you look at it, we've had some drop off. We've had some new parties created in this country, and the way in which the key issues also change and adapt, and we've had that happen throughout. What I see is happening is, look, you've got this populist streak that's happening in both bases, the Republican base and the Democratic base. There's a lot to be said. There's some people that are very smart people that'll say, look, there's a lot more. Um, there's a lot of synergies happening with a Donald Trump voter and a Bernie Sanders voter,
mhm.
as opposed to a Mitt Romney voter and a Hillary Clinton voter. They share a lot of the similar values. Now you could take the life issue off, and that would certainly be like a wedge between them. Maybe some other cultural issues too. But in terms of the economic side of it, and maybe in the foreign policy side, those two sides seem more aligned in a lot of different ways too. So I do see a realignment going on both sides. I don't know that Donald Trump has captured the base. I think the base has been there for a little bit of time, and Donald Trump actually gave voice to it. And I think so that's the way I would describe it in terms of what I've seen when I talk to folks and when I see the research. And I do think that you're seeing this challenge that certain establishment politicians have with that reality. So they try to give it lip service, or they try to talk about it, and it's not genuine. And what voters hate more than anything else, I'm going to tell you this. This is a universal rule that I've not seen. This is gravity. Is that if you are not authentic, the voters smell it and they know it, and they will likely reject it. Now, maybe there's someone that's more inauthentic or not aligned with their values, but overall, it does affect your ability to be a successful politician if you are inauthentic, because it's not easy to pull off.
Mhm. And you touched on that. I think that's such an interesting comparison because I see it myself, to be honest. Like, I like speaking like for other people too when I hear in survey data, but I see them myself. Like, transparently, in 2016, I was quite enthused about. I was rather disenchanted in 2020, and even kind of more so to today. But then I see like they have this pull to like RFK, like not all his views, but like where he's like coming from. And I'm like, these are two different like people. Same with Sanders. If Sanders were to run again, which he's not, but if he were, I'd be much more inclined. I just think over like my personal political arc and how you said though, specifically economic and foreign policy, because what you can see economically are people are struggling, prices are high. They were just flaunting like inflation's at 2-year low. Then going back from 2 years is at 4%. But you do a little quick analysis of those numbers and you find out that but housing's still up. Housing's still like 8%. It's like grocery items that are driving it down. But housing's still up quite a bit at 8%, I believe. And then foreign policy, we can't support people at home, can't support homeless population that's ever more growing, mental health crisis.
Right.
Yep, we have billions for Ukraine. We have billions to give them for a war that's much more complicated and nuanced than establishment people may lend to believe and give off. So I see that myself. Like I speak for other
Yeah.
people, but I'm also in that group a good amount of the time as well. So it's interesting.
Well, you're this is just where people shake their heads and they say, these are the same decisions that people have been making my entire lifetime. And where has it gotten us? And look, inflation is more under control now, but prices are sticky. I mean,
Hmm.
people. I look at it and I'm buying things and I do fairly well, but I look at it and I'm like, my goodness, this stuff is super expensive. It wasn't that way 2 or 3 years ago, and you have to take a look at it and say, can I afford this? Can you not afford this? And a person that's making minimum wage, or a person that's making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, they really have concerns about these kinds of things, and that's where the disconnect often is. And look, I will say that that's where the Democrats have the biggest problem right now. The economy is still the number one issue going into this. You've got a president that is got really low approval ratings. People don't really think that he's up for the job. So certainly the Republicans we have our own problems, and there's no doubt about it. But I think the Democrats have even bigger problems, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are holding the pen as this economy takes shape. And voters, most times, probably 7 out of 10 times, will vote on economic matters more than anything else. And that's where they've got the biggest
Hmm.
exposure.
And you saw a defiance of that kind of rule within the midterms, with abortion now climbing. And
Yeah, I push back against.
you push back on that?
Yeah, I do. I think this is one of those ones where the media narrative again was not completely correct. I think
Well,
there was
let me just
yeah, please.
articulate a little on that. So you could make that case, but I'd also say the referendums in places like Kansas, I believe Michigan, another one, when voting for a judge that was pretty heavy on pro-life, and they were, I want to say it was Michigan, but maybe it's Wisconsin actually. It actually might have been Wisconsin now I say it out loud. But
Yeah.
there's point being, there's been referendums when they asked, the people who who they would vote for, or how they feel about this issue, like abortion being. And most of the times they do vote on the side of choice. And to quickly conclude here is, I think there's an excellent point that someone made, which pretty much entails that when someone has a freedom and someone has, whether you agree with that or not, taking it away is terribly difficult to do without, once that becomes a norm, now receding that norm is a whole nother fight.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that point. I mean, I think that that's where
Hmm.
there's a challenge always in this. But what I would say is, your earlier comment about the midterm elections and abortion, I think abortion was a factor, and I think it was an increased factor than it would have been before the Dobbs decision. I will agree with that, and I think there was a time period in the summer before the midterms that had really spiked, but I think it had downplayed a little bit too. I think there were other factors, and this is where I say that the media just takes these things and they draw a lesson, and it just becomes fact. um, when I was actually involved in the races, and you're actually on the ground, campaigns matter. The way in which you run a campaign, the candidates matter too.
Hmm.
I do think that if Republicans had run better campaigns in some of these states, we would have won the Senate. And I look at a place like Nevada, where there was a fairly establishment campaign. The campaign itself was not prosecuted correctly, in my opinion. So I look at that, or certainly in Georgia, I think we had a very flawed candidate in Georgia, and probably Pennsylvania too. I mean, that's a stunning one to me that happened. I was not involved in those races, but I look at it and I know that it's not likely what the media is going to say the big macro lesson is. It's more likely going to be micro lessons in terms of how a campaign was prosecuted, the decisions that were made, in mechanical things that they didn't do or did do correctly. The other side did correctly that
Hmm.
you and I probably won't know. So it's easy to say it's abortion that had the biggest impact. Now going back to those the referendums, look again, I'll say it's the same lesson too. How much money is one side raising versus the other? How many people are they actually putting out there? Who's running the better actual campaign to convince voters? So it's not always just abortion versus non-abortion, because you'll find some other states that are probably likely going to restrict abortion more, and it's going to pass there. So it's going to happen both places. But these things actually do matter, and that's one of the messages I always like to convey.
For sure. And let me rephrase. Abortion had an increased influence. It was an increased factor
It did.
than historically.
Agreed.
That's yeah.
Agreed.
And as you were talking about other campaigns, I literally wrote down Walker and Oz, which was and then you said it. I was like, yep, yeah. So that is the quality of the candidate, and as a campaign is prosecuted, obviously matters quite a bit too. You also saw a fundraising, because a lot of grassroots, say, donors were actually donating to Trump, which people started to complain about.
There
But
was that issue too,
yeah,
certainly.
so no, that's a fair call out, and I would agree with it. But I I will say I think that when it comes down, I think you see this with the Second Amendment too, but regardless of that, not to get into that, but with polling data on like just abortion things, it's usually people defer, like they're reasonable. People are, I think, reasonable people,
I
and
agree.
they defer to choice, and they're not okay with third term abortions, but they're also not okay with no abortions either.
It
And
depends on how you look. I think
mhm,
that's probably right, but it depends on how the question is asked in these polls too.
always.
I think that's a big part of this. And look, so some of this narrative will be like, the women are. Some people will say women are more pro-choice, and that's probably true. But there's a bunch of women out there, and there's a pretty big percentage that are
Mhm,
pro-life. What does that pro-life stand? Where do they draw the line? And these are the questions and the debates that are had. And I think they're legitimate debates to be had, and I think that they should be done a little bit with the more humility and grace than always often happens. But
mhm,
that's the way it works. So your point's taken, but I do think that so these public polls too. These are really interesting things. Really interesting things. I'd love to touch on that too if we have a
mhm.
moment to talk about it.
Go
I
for it.
actually think that they do the American people more of a disservice than anything else, and the media is the messenger for these things. So there's two things that happen. Usually it's these issues in terms of where people are. And I think those are very valuable about where people are, but you have to really understand how the polls are being asked. But then these horse race polls as well, which they say, okay, well, you're polling at 22% and you're polling at 14%. So there's no way that the 14% person can win. Monmouth University, I think, was that actually said last year that they're no longer going to be doing horse race polling. And I think that is one of the best things that can happen to our democracy because the media will never understand how to read a public poll. They have no idea how to do this stuff, and what they do is they basically make the races fait accomplis about who's leading, and they don't let the race, as we talked about earlier, let the race play
Mhm,
out because they think this is the way it's going to be, and it's static. Well, the way in which a political professional uses it, someone that I do it, I don't use public polls the way most people
mhm.
do. We use them in a very different way about how we can message, how we can use that information to actually try to win a race rather than say, okay, this is where it is. That's the least interesting thing in a poll to me. And I would say that too for like something like on support for abortion. Okay, fine. If someone says that, let's say it's 55-45 pro-life, pro-choice versus pro-life right now in a given state. Well, my job is to say, okay, well, maybe we're not using the best arguments right now. How does the pro-life side make a better argument to people so that they can understand that that this will work? And if you do it the right way, you can change that public perception to 52-48 our side. I mean, we're not talking about numbers where it's like there's unanimous consent amongst the American people. We're talking about certain issues and certain policy ideas. So I think you can go do those kinds of things. And I think that's where the value of polling is more than just this is what people believe, if that makes sense.
It does. It's a lot. I think when it comes down to like the fundamental questions though, whether something is okay or not, and whether you would agree with it, like you could definitely, I won't say manipulate, influence the factors and how the question's being asked. But I think at the end of it, like I think people could still recognize where their answer would lie. And historical data, excuse me, you would see that it doesn't really fluctuate with like banning all abortions. And then I know like this is your like the same pushback that you just give to it, and it's taken, and it's definitely a good point. But I think when it comes down to like the values of things, they it's been tried and tested quite a bit. But I am mhm,
Look, so let's. I mean, it's an interesting discussion, and it's a little bit off the presidential campaigns. I
yeah.
know that, but like today, the Washington Post released
Mhm,
a series of polls where they say that Black Americans basically
mhm,
say they're experiencing better treatment than they did in 2006 and 2011, but they fear the worst for the future in terms of racism getting worse. So that's basically the
mhm,
conclusions that they drive. Now, the headline, I'm not going to talk about how ridiculous the headline was in the Washington Post because that's not. Um, uh, okay, I guess the headline is Black Americans more upbeat but fear worsening racism. Polls fine. That's what it is. So fine. Now, what's our inferences from that? Is it because Black Americans are being told that we're more racist? Or is it maybe that has some impact on where they're going on this kind of thing? That's what I would think would be happening when you look at results like this, because they're experiencing better treatment when they get service. They think it's a better time to be a Black American than they did a year ago or 2 years ago. So that's what some of this polling says in terms of what they're experiencing, but they fear the future is worse. So a lot of times the media will take their narratives and they will comport the narratives to what they want it to believe, and it will also influence some of these numbers too. That's where, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that just because America is where it is today, or the last 5 years, that it can't change if you have the better argument.
That's interesting. And I think, as you said, like there's a lot about like feeling and perception that matters a lot. That you can almost like feel tensions in society. And I think you kind of saw that with post George Floyd,
Mm.
that I personally couldn't understand. Like I didn't really have that experience really with the police, or maybe the people who participate didn't, but there's like a feeling that it makes like sense, that it is true, that's a truism, and I can almost like not agree with it but understand it. I can understand 'cause, and that's, I don't know if that
Yeah.
plays into it, but
So
mhm,
I went to George Floyd's funeral.
mhm,
I happened to have an opportunity to go, and I did the media for it pro bono, for the
mhm,
family there. So I actually was there in Minneapolis when that happened, and I, like a bunch of Americans, saw that tape. So when I was in the governor's office, I actually worked with Nina
mhm.
Turner, who you may know, who's a
I know Nate Turner. Yeah,
very
yeah,
liberal
very
Democrat.
left, very
We
left.
worked on some police reform issues together.
Yeah, I
We
follow
had
her.
some high profile cases here in Ohio where I think that we could have done better. So I went to that funeral, both because it was a horrific thing that happened to George Floyd. I mean, no one will ever say that he deserved to die that day, and that's not an appropriate way to go. And there was an inflection point in this country where I thought, okay, if I go to this and do this thing, first of all, it's a nice thing to do for the family, but then it's also an opportunity for a Republican to be there. Maybe we can actually get some, like, a few things that I think can be reasonable police reform. But then what that turned into was riots in the street, calls for defunding the police. Everything is white supremacy. Smithsonian put something out that summer that said that if you demand your employees go on time, or if you make them dress in a tie, that you're a white supremacist. And I'm not a white guy, right? I'm not. But
Mhm,
I mean, it's one of these things that I look at this and I said it was used as a cudgel. It was used as a device to divide us and push us further away from anything else. And it actually made me more conservative. That
mhm.
whole process, where I actually went into it saying, I might be able, maybe we can get a little bit, a few things that actually can get the few bad cops out, that can actually improve the system. And it turned into something that was that if you're not on our side, you are basically either white adjacent or a supremacist. And it so quickly changed things. And I think it was a major inflection point in American history. And I think it has effects till today.
For sure. And I know we're off topic, but
We are.
I really enjoy this, and I find it fascinating that you did that, and appreciate the goodwill there, because it definitely did see it was like COVID. Like there's a point opportunity, I should say, where something out of something awful and a tragedy could come something good, but it just didn't. And
No, it was all bad. It was all bad that came from that, in my
And
opinion.
but I'm curious about Nina Turner, because I do follow her in Twitter, and I do oftentimes disagree. There's some things that she says are like around the mark, but
I
most
like
of
Nina a lot. I think, I personally, I've
mhm,
always got along with her. I think she's and she's very good at getting her message out. I disagree with her on
mhm.
99% of the things, I
Yeah.
promise you. But personally, I've always gotten along with her well. I'm sorry, what was your question?
No, no, yeah, I'm just curious of how like your, I guess, working relationship was, and how, if you found, because on Twitter, as most people are, and this what annoys me about person
Sure.
is, it's very, comes off very like authoritarian, like now we need this,
Yeah.
all caps. I'm like, yeah, this is
Oh
annoying.
no! Look, I
But
would disagree. Like I
mhm,
said, I disagree with her 99% of the time. But I think there
mhm,
was a time when she said that we happened to work on
mhm,
police reform, and that we got some reasonable things done here in Ohio, around that actually I think made things better. And we actually got
mhm,
the sheriffs and the highway patrol and police chiefs together on the same page, and they were able to figure out how to do a little bit better, so that maybe for training or things like that. So that look, at the end of the day, the issue with the police, when you look at it, and we can get back to Nina too, the issue of the police is, a lot of times the community doesn't, it's about efficacy, right?
mhm,
It's about having the trust of the community to say that you're actually fighting for them, you're actually doing what they need. And I think most people in communities around the country would say that, yeah, we want them here, they do a good job. But it's always the few bad apples that, if you can handle and take care of, you're going to solve a lot of the problems. You're not going to get 100%. And this is not about getting 100%. It's about getting most of it done. And I think that's where we were able to work on some of those issues. But, Nina's very effective at getting messages out and getting a base riled up. But she was also very able to get certain parts together so that we could work together and get something done too. So when she puts her mind to it, she's very effective.
Nice, yeah. Because like I said, from Twitter, like it seems like a lot of just noise, a lot of just demands. But it's good to hear that you guys
Well, look, I would
up.
also say that Twitter is
Mhm.
not real life, right? I mean, most people, it's the most
No, it's
performative
not.
thing that we've had in the country, and I think you probably understand this better than with the title of your
Hmm.
podcast. You kind of get it, but it is people always clutch their pearls. That I find that the establishment or the
Hmm.
elites, they clutch their pearls when they see someone say something on Twitter, and it's like, guys, just move on. It's not real. Just
Hmm.
go to what they're actually doing, what the actions are, not what people are saying on Twitter, because that just drives a message so that it feeds this ecosystem that's awful, but it does.
Interesting, interesting. But that anecdote and little side combo and subtopic, I enjoyed it a lot. And move it like I also want to touch on something with because we said foreign policy, economic policy, kind of dove into that. But with the war in Ukraine, how Trump is getting back to the presidential campaigns, realignment, how Trump is kind of saying that I would never got into this war, we never would have been in this war, and oftentimes says as well that elect me day one, the war to be over. I'm going to take care of it. I know exactly how to end it. Basically, and also questioning a lot of what we do like in the war. But
Yeah.
when it first started, he was a little more hawkish on how we should handle about war efforts in Ukraine. But then shortly after, I think only a couple months, pivoted to more of this anti-war stance. What do you think that goes into? Do you think he
So I
figured it?
actually don't remember when he was more hawkish on it, I guess, but
It was in the very beginning. It was in.
I couldn't speak to that. I don't remember
Mhm.
his comments on that, to be
Okay.
honest with you, but I do know that, JD Vance, my colleague, he's been very America first on this. There's a growing strain, and I think there's a growing strain of Americans, not just Republicans, but that are saying that we need to figure out what we're doing, and this can't be a blank check of what we're doing. Is this in our interest? Now, look, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I can't like argue the
Mhm.
ins and outs. I've watched this stuff for a long time. I tend to be probably more establishment on this stuff, but I think there are legitimate conversations that can be had. Um, are when you send troops to a place, or you send, and we haven't sent troops, I understand that, but that's always where the conversation is going to go, because you're talking about sending your most valuable resources, the people that you should cherish the most, and going to war, or supporting wars, is not something that should be taken lightly. We've had several swings in this country where we go neocon, where we go away from this, and where do we end up? And these are all legitimate conversations to be had about what is the true best use of our military, the best use of our resources, and in terms of our national interest, because we should always do things in our national interest. And again, you can argue that maybe Ukraine is in your national interest. It's a legitimate argument to be made. But it also is a legitimate argument to say, no, look, we can't be fighting this. We have to really worry only about China and something else, which is what I think a lot of the folks on the right, this populist strain on the right, are saying. And there is a lot of thought behind it. Where look, I think there was also, when if you took a stance against Ukraine in the beginning of this, you were basically laughed out of studios around the country, and MSNBC, CNN, wherever it
Mhm.
is, were derided. But there's a legitimate argument to be had, and I don't think that's a healthy thing to do either. I think you can have these conversations and figure out where the right place to be is. But I also think that those folks that I was talking about don't truly understand where the American people are on these kinds of things. There's a fatigue in this country amongst regular Americans about how we conduct our foreign policy, and I think it's a valuable conversation to be had. And I think it'll be part of
Mhm.
this. But I don't think that Americans usually vote in a presidential contest on foreign policy. I think that's part of it, but it's a very small part of it. Like, as I said, I think economics is the biggest issue there. Sometimes crime.
Mhm.
But I certainly think it's going to be an issue, and I think it's going to be one of these conversations that's going to be had over the next 10 years about what our foreign policy looks like.
I agree with you that I don't think Americans mainly vote, and you are obviously the expert here, but just my 2 cents. I don't believe that Americans vote mainly on foreign policy either. But in contrast to domestic policy, can be a motivating factor. For example, I I don't know who would make this. Trump maybe would make this, that you cut the child tax credit months ago, Democrats and Republicans, yet you send billions to Ukraine.
Sure.
That is a awful point for both parties. That's
Absolutely.
terrible. But to go forward,
or
um,
or the border, right? The border is another issue
yeah.
that conservatives are really upset about, where there's this crisis on the border. There's thousands of people coming every day over
Mhm.
the border, and we're not doing anything on our border, but we're worrying about someone else's too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's you can worry about both things. You can make that argument too, but I mean, it's almost like dismissed
Yeah.
by the establishment, and I mean the establishment both parties too. And I don't think that's a good way to proceed.
No, and you see both Trump and someone like RFK playing into that field, saying like we have to rethink our policy there. And I think it, when you said like most Americans don't vote on foreign policy, but it's also, which again agree with, but it's also when you're risking nuclear war, and if that becomes more apparent, that be because the argument now is basically that since Russia hasn't utilized a nuclear weapon on the battlefield, they won't, which is silly in my estimate and most people's estimates, because that's not to say they haven't escalated. They have drafted their population when they said they would. They have targeted critical infrastructure and key resources in Ukraine. They have become target more civilian populations in areas. So they have escalated this war. They just haven't gone to the point where they have nuked a part of the world yet. And it's another thing I've heard. It's like boiling the frog. Like they might not just jump to the nuclear weapon, but dissent that's allowed in Russia right now is dissent that calls for nuclear usage on the battlefield. And I don't want to get too far off to it. I want to close and pose a question with this is that I do think that could change though in this election with such high stakes on the line and such a contrast between foreign policy support for Ukraine and so little for the daily American people. Could that not become more of a motivating factor? Because personally, it is one for me.
Yeah, and I think look, it's like I said, I think it's going to be part of the conversation, and I think it's going to be more about where you stand on that as a brushstroke to the full painting of who a candidate is. And it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be an important brushstroke, but it's not going to be the central thing, in my opinion, that most people are going to vote for, the gettable voters. But I do think it's going to be a central piece of where the elite talkers talk about it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will be it will have an effect. Certainly, it's going to be when you go to a diner, and sometimes I do this. I love going to just a diner and hearing what people are talking about it,
Mm-hmm.
and the people will start to say, well, can you believe that they're sending this much over there? They're not doing this. So as a comparison, as you mentioned, to the domestic policies and the money that's being spent there, I think it's going to be an issue in a conversation around those diner tables, that as people get their fried eggs and sausage in the morning.
For sure. No, and I think that's pretty cool that you do that. You're just like, or I think most people do that. Maybe just they
Yeah,
don't recognize it. Yeah, they just hear in.
you want to hear
But
what people are saying, and what people are saying
mhm,
where you're not. It's on even in folks when you do a focus group. Focus groups are very helpful at times,
mhm.
but I mean, again, people know they're on the spot. They know what they're going to say, and you just want to go hear what people actually think in real life.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that a lot of things can change, but if you had to make some kind of prediction, I don't know if you do this often or maybe not at all, but if you had to make some kind of prediction, who would you say will be the nominees of each major party? And who would you say wins the election? I know it's so far out, but I'm
Very
still,
early.
it's very
So
early. I know.
here's how I would answer the question. I mean, based on the information I have today, I still think Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. I think Joe Biden's going to be the nominee. I think that they're going to be deeply flawed candidates, and both will be below 50% in approval. And I think that's an unbelievable
Mhm,
thing to have. But I think there's a lot of people that said there's a year ago, no way Donald Trump's going to be the nominee, that are saying, well, maybe he will be. Okay. And I think there's a lot of people that say, no way Donald Trump's going to be president again. Well, I'm not certain about that. Don't listen to the pundit class. I don't know who's going to be president. I think I want to wait to see how the campaign plays out. I want to see how Joe Biden's health plays out. I think that's a huge factor here too. I mean, look, the media doesn't like to talk about it. The comedians on late night don't like to talk about it, but I mean, he doesn't look great. That has an effect. He doesn't, when he speaks
mhm,
out there, he doesn't always, he's not always coherent. That has an effect on things. And these matter in the way in politics work. It's not always about what policy position you take, or boy, this person got indicted. I like this person. I connect with them. I think this person's going to fight for me. I think this person's going to do a good job. I think this person, back when Trump was before the pandemic, one of the numbers that I look at is the right track, wrong track. So Gallup does this, like, how satisfied are you with
Yeah.
America? They do this every month, and it's the thing that I think is probably the biggest indicator of what's going to happen in an election. I truly believe that. Before the pandemic, I think it was like 46 or 47% of Americans thought things were going well in America. They were satisfied with the direction of America. That was a high number. We hadn't seen numbers like that in over a decade, since before the housing bubble happened. And today that number, or the last time they ran the poll, I should say, the number is 18%. That tells you something. If people are that dissatisfied, what do they try to do? They look for change. And when they look for change, they're going to say, okay, well, things were a lot better before the pandemic. The pandemic's changed everything. And I absolutely acknowledge that. But those are the kinds of things that, and I believe that if the pandemic had never happened, I think Donald Trump would have been reelected.
Most people, yeah.
So, those are interesting things. So I think that Donald Trump could be president again. Whether or not some of the media elites and some of the people in the Democratic and Republican Party like to believe that, I think it's very possible.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to throw something out there too. How do you think? So, say your prediction is correct, which it at this time.
It's not a prediction yet. I'm saying it's possible.
Okay.
It's a possibility.
Right. I'm saying your prediction about the nominees. Would you call
okay.
the prediction about the nominees? How does now Cornel West running in the Green Party primaries and getting him on a ballot, does that do much to Joe Biden? Does that take a sliver away when it's this close?
I think third parties, for the most part, you always expect them to take 2 or 3%, and you factor that into this thing. I don't think it has that much of an effect. I mean, the last third party that had an impact was Ross Perot, but he actually put money behind it. He actually had a message that was central to where people were in the country at the time. I mean, he had an effective message and he had an effective way about doing it. I don't really give a lot of credence to third parties in this country. I think it's largely a joke.
Well, I guess to push back on that, if you, as I'm sure you're familiar with, Joe Biden only won 5 states over 150,000 votes, or with 150,000 votes, and won 3 states with 30,000 votes. So even if you do the low of 2%, that could have quite the effect.
But it takes from both sides too. I mean, it'll take the Green Party will take disproportionately from the Democrats, and the Libertarian Party will take disproportionately from Republicans. Okay, so but they still take from both sides. And sometimes they motivate some people that would not vote too. So it's not like this clear-cut thing. Okay, it's a 50,000 thing here. Again, I think when you're doing these kinds of things and you're running state by state races, you're looking at those and you kind of bake that into your equation when you know who's going to be on the ballot, and you work that out to try to figure this out. Now, that's not to say that it can never have an impact. I just think that by and large they usually don't, and I think that I'll say that people that actually work on this stuff, I think they're it's like it's like blowing. They're taking a principle stand, and I'm never going to argue against someone taking a principle stand if that's what you're doing, but it's really not going to have an impact on the election.
Okay, I'm curious to see how that one plays out, because you do see, like, in hindsight, I think Jill Stein was looked at as being a spoiler to Hillary Clinton in like one state. It wasn't like the campaign, but like
it can happen.
But I think when it's so close, that like is a serious, like, in Biden's campaign, if I was involved in any capacity, like, what do we do to kind of like suppress this? Because as you mentioned just now,
oh, Democrats suppressing things? I've never heard that before. That's a good one. I love that.
hence why they have the first primary in South Carolina and switched up the order. Yeah.
Right.
But with that, I mean, I would be quite concerned. I mean, I'm the ignorant one here, but I will say I would say I'll be quite concerned with it, because I think Cornel West does have that message. I heard a little from him. I don't exactly agree, and I'm not just saying I speak for a plurality of people, but I do think he has a little more of a message. I think he's more well-renowned than most third-party candidates to believe. I think he'll have more of a backing than some, maybe similar to Jill Stein, and he switched from the People's Party to the Green Party for these exact reasons, to get on the ballot, to have more support. And I just think when the race is going to come down to such, probably like the wire.
Yeah, look, I will say this too: like, Republicans will want someone like him to do well. They will want that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Draws disproportionately from the Democrats, but the Democrats will do the same thing for Republicans with Libertarians in certain places in the ballot, or some some other constitutional party, whatever party that they're talking about. So it goes both ways, and I think at the end of the day, it kind of is a wash, is what I would argue,
I got you.
because it's happening on both sides a little bit.
Well, do you know who the libertarian candidates
I
are?
don't, I don't, I don't.
I think that's kind of my point. Like, I don't know, but I do know more about. So I think that kind of brings like the name
Right, but I mean,
brand.
look, in Gary Johnson was a well-known
Mhm,
libertarian that ran before, and he did almost nothing. I mean, remember the guy? First of all, the guy didn't know what Aleppo was at the time, right? I mean,
mhm.
these guys. So he was a former governor, and he was running as a libertarian. So I mean, they've had these things. I don't know who they're going to nominate. I have no idea. I don't have any insight into that, but my sense is that they will also be marginal at the end of the day.
I gotcha. I gotcha.
It's
And
always the hope that a
mhm,
third party, by these third party folks, that their third party is going to go do something, they're going to have an impact, but it's rarely the case that they do. The only time in my lifetime that's happened again is Ross Perot, and he was just a unusual force.
mhm. And then, but then Carter look at Anderson as
He
kind of,
did, yeah. And look,
but he
again,
was gonna lose anyway.
that's before my lifetime, so I'm not
Mhm,
gonna. I've just read about that, so I don't
mhm.
have like firsthand knowledge of those kinds of things. But yeah,
Gotcha.
but I think that was some kind of an effect.
Cool. And I mean, we're approaching the hour mark, but this conversation is fascinating to me. And there's a couple, I guess, last kind of things on my mind, which is
Sure.
you've pointed out that you're not the biggest fan of public polls, and you laid out good reasons as to why that is. But I do feel sentiment, but also some polling too, that Americans are more supportive of, say, public sector unions, at least, but I think labor unions altogether. Now, historically, there's a high than prior than ever before, really. I probably to like the 70s or 60s, maybe, when they really got crushed in the 70s. But the point being is that do you see that as opportunity for the Republican Party to capitalize upon? Because you even had senators like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and maybe JD Vance, I'm not sure, vote against crushing the labor union, the what was it, the rail worker labor union strike. And I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that was before this
I think
J.
so.
So I think that, but your point is, look, I think you said public sector or private sector unions on that.
I don't think it's specified, but I would assume people interpret it as both and they don't make that distinction. But I know there is a difference.
Okay, I was just curious about this. Look, and look again. My disdain for public polls is that it's misused for the
Mhm.
most part. Not that there's no value in them, but it's that
Gotcha.
it's misused, and it's misused by the media. But that there's value in discussing these kinds of things. So in terms of the unions, I think that there is a couple things there, and I think that when you look at policy, I think there's a different policy between public unions or private unions, and maybe Americans support both, and maybe it gets conflated there. I'm not truly like a current on what people think there. But I also think that there's a difference between like teachers unions
Yeah.
versus police unions. So even there's a difference as well too. So I do think that part of this realignment is, and you hear a lot, is that the Republican Party is becoming more of the working class party. And what does that mean? That means a lot of union folks that are in that, right? And I think that's more on the ideologies, not the union leaders. There's a difference between the union leaders and where the union membership writ large, right? Because I think a lot of times especially when you're looking at private sector unions or even like police unions or firefighters unions, a lot of the membership, they're becoming more conservative.
Hmm.
They're driving a lot of Republican policies, but there's still a divide probably between them and their leadership too. So I think that's part of the issue. Take the teachers unions out of it too, because I think that they are. My guess is that they are universally looked. The way in which people look at them, especially after the way they handle the pandemic, is much lower. I think that's probably a different one. But they drive a
Hmm.
lot of politics on the Democratic side.
Hmm. And do you think, I guess, moving forward with that, that will be capitalized upon, like leaning
Yeah,
more into you?
I do. I think that you're going to see a lot more policies amongst the Republican side that will be supported by different unions, and I think there's going to be a separation again about which unions they were talking about, because I think
Hmm.
that matters.
For sure.
But especially as they share their values, both culturally and economically, I think you're going to see that happen, and I think the Republican Party will continue to become more of a party of the working class. But it's a fight that's
Hmm.
going on right now, certainly is.
For sure. And there's one popping in my mind when we spoke a lot about the Republican Party realignment, but I know you said they're kind of in tandem with just the Democratic Party as well in that realignment. And I wanted to get your opinion as you said, more working class, which is I believe true, and poll data shows
Oh, it
that
absolutely shows it. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
there's
it's
no clearer data on this
uh-huh.
than that.
But yeah, with that moving more towards the Republican party and voting that way, where do you see the Democrats play in this? Where are they kind of realigning to? And
Yeah, look, I think they're also having their own little civil war inside too, and you know, you've got the AOC Bernie Sanders wing versus the establishment wing. You look, I remember last year I saw one of a graph where it showed all of the chairs of the House and Senate establishment,
mhm,
all their committee chairs. They literally were on the coast, on the Democratic coast, on the West Coast, or on the East Coast, and they had no none of their senators or representatives that had party chairmanships were in middle America. So there's this divide that's going on, and it is, I think, a lot more on class now than it is when you take the coast out of it. It's a lot more on class. It's a lot more on urban versus suburban and rural. Where I think that that's where this divide is going, and I think the Democrats have to cater more towards that college educated type
mhm,
voter, and maybe someone that's living in a city. I think that's really where
gotcha.
this is.
I'm going to assist the person I speak on about the Democratic primaries and the realignment there, but I do want to get your input into this as well, which is why do you think they play so? And the Republicans do this too, I believe. So put that out there. They just do it inadvertently. But
Okay.
why? But why do you think they play so hard into identity politics?
Well, it's because
Like,
look, they're
mhm,
playing, in my opinion, of where the Democrats are on this, and I think this is really one of the reasons that this realignment is going on. I think I think Republicans are reacting a lot, not completely, but a lot to where the Democrats are going. And why do they play this? It's because what the base demands, it's what the loudest folks want, and it's what I talked about. It's where it comes from the exclusive universities, which is where a lot of Democrats' ideas are born. It comes from these coastal cities and it comes from these cocktail parties where they go and they have these conversations, and it's just not what real Americans want. And so um, this was a very interesting conversation that I had about 6 months ago. I was invited to speak at a elite universities. They had a program in Washington where they had about 25 students that came to DC. I
mhm,
actually got to do something like this when I was in college too. Very interesting programs, and it's a very elite university, one of the top universities in the country. And I got to speak to their class that had come to DC for about an hour and a half, and brilliant kids, bright, but they could not understand that I was not telling them my opinions based on something that I think that people want to hear, that I was pandering to voters, that I actually had different views to them. They couldn't like comprehend that. And that was like the whole conversation, that I was absolutely in the wrong, and I was just doing this for politics. Um, it's that belief that drives a lot of the Democratic policies, in my opinion. It was a fascinating thing to see. I'll give you one example too. So one of the questions was, why didn't JD Vance say that what happened on January 6th was wrong? And I said, well, he did. He did. He said that. He said that this January 6th things, the events of January 6th were wrong and shouldn't have happened. But they said, well, why doesn't he make it the central part of his campaign? Why isn't he just saying it every time? I said, well, look, that's your opinion that it's the number one issue, but voters, they don't care about it. That, I mean, it's putting bread on the table. It's inflation at the time. It's these other things. That's what voters care about. But they wanted him to actually prosecute a case to why this is the number one, number two, number three issue above all else, and tell voters that they're wrong for not thinking it's the number one issue. And it's that kind of mentality that I see that's driving so much of this thing, and so frustrating for people. And I do think that that is what is pushing Republicans and changing the way in which people are thinking about Democrats. I talk to former Democrats all the time, and I've never seen something like this, where there's so many people that said, yeah, I'm a Democrat, or I used to be a Democrat, but I just don't buy what they're doing here. And they're really driving people, sometimes in middle America, out. And it's a fascinating thing to watch.
agree. I think too, because if it wasn't Trump, like if most likely if it wasn't gonna be Trump and Biden, but even see this with like DeSantis too, actually. So I shouldn't say if it was gonna be anyone else,
Sure.
but I do just see such a dissatisfaction with Both parties' current prospects for the presidential
You see
campaign
the dissatisfaction amongst whom?
amongst people who just general populations. For
Mhm.
example, let me give you an example. Maybe it's not the verbatim of that, but more than ever now, U.S. adults are identifying as independents than winning party, and I have it right here. I believe it's from
Sure.
Gallup
I think that's probably
or
true.
Axios. Yeah, and it's
I'll accept that.
yeah. I'm like fact checking myself on this,
Mhm.
but yeah, but I think that speaks that dissatisfaction. I it's
But
interesting.
people, so that's, it's an interesting thing when you look at that, right? So when I look at those numbers and I see that, independents are growing, but still amongst that sliver, most of them lean either Republican or lean Democrat too. So that actual true independent thing is not as big as people like to make it seem, is what I would argue to you. But it's a valid point and it's something to look at, but it's not as, they just don't like identifying with this stuff.
And it's like, why though? It's like,
I mean, there's good points. Yeah.
yeah, it's the why behind it. But kind of like wrapping up, I do want to ask, because you're based in Ohio, you
Yeah.
worked with people from Ohio, such as Nia Turner, and you got some obviously a lot of history there. And I do want to ask about East Palestine. I was never able to do a full episode on it due to just scheduling conflicts and just didn't work out. But being based out there, I do want to provide the listeners and myself, like, do you have any information on it, how they're doing? Because it seemed to be like a focal point for about
Yeah,
three
look, I
weeks.
think those folks are still struggling. I think property values are still there.
Mhm.
There's challenges there. I think that they still believe that all of a sudden that the American media they came upon them and watched them and like zoo animals a little bit, and then they moved on
Yeah.
once the story wasn't as big, which is so often happens in this country. Now there's still a bill that's moving through Congress that that JD Vance and Sherrod
Mhm.
Brown, both senators from Ohio, are trying to get passed, that if that gets passed, it'll have some effect in terms of the way rail safety is done. So there are some people that are still watching out, but I think that it's one of those. It's another example in our of what we've been talking about. It's kind of like the through line through this conversation that we've had. The media will go do things when there's ratings, but when it's kind of past, and there's something else, they'll jump to something else.
Mhm.
And there's real consequences to that, because there's people there, they're struggling, and I would argue too, you're not late to the story. You can still go do that story and bring more light to it still, because I think those people would welcome it, with this, as long as it's done with in an earnest way and not an exploitative way, which so much of this stuff happens. These are real issues, and they're just regular people that were doing their living their lives, and all of a sudden a disaster strikes, and your heart goes out to them, and hopefully that things will continue to happen. But I do think that a lot of people have forgotten.
For sure, for sure. And it seemed like a political moment and opportunity for both. Like as soon as Trump there, then it was like, oh, Biden can't go because it looks bad. Like
Sure.
second there, and as you said though, but after some time, it just faded. But
Yeah.
also, as
Yeah,
you said, the people
but
there
there'll
sort.
be another tragedy, and then this will happen. This is where the way history repeats itself. And look, if I haven't mentioned my disdain for the American news media, the modern media, enough on this conversation,
Yeah,
I'm going to say it one more time as we're wrapping up, because I really do
yeah.
disdain it.
No, it's brutal, and I'm glad you said that too, because maybe we'll revisit the topic and try to get someone on to local to the area or just has some
Yeah, I think it'd be
insight
worth
into
it.
it. Sure. Well, once again, thank you for your time. I
Enjoyed
I,
it.
I appreciate likewise, and thank you for the listeners for tuning in. I think there's so many different takeaways, and I actually I don't always listen back to the episode once published, but I always listen to it when editing, obviously. But this is definitely one I'll listen to post publishment, because it's not always the best to hear your voice over and over again. Can be
Oh
quite
God, I
annoying.
hate listening to my voice. I'll
Yeah,
never listen to it. I promise you, it's the worst.
but I do want to hear this conversation at least once more. But yeah, thank you for your time, Jay. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the audience for tuning in for such an intriguing conversation.
Thanks so much. Have a great one.